Legalizing drugs has become an ever more growing topic of discussion and debate. Many see the benefits that come when we legalize drugs, but others see the harms it can impose on society. No matter how you view it, it's a very complex topic to discuss. For this video, I'm going to talk about the many benefits that legalizing drugs brings to society. I'm also going to talk about the classification of drugs and why it's important that we classify drugs correctly. Firstly, though, I'm going to give a brief history on why we even decided to legalize drugs in the first place. In the 19th century, substances like opiates and cocaine were widely used for medical purposes. The regulations were minimal, and these drugs were often found as over the counter products. Coming into the 19th century, those saw a rising concern in addiction and social problems. The Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 marked the beginning of a strict drug regulation in the USA as we moved into the 1930s. This strict drug regulation lasted all the way almost to the 1970s on the criminalization rather than the addiction treatment, resulting in mass incarceration and significant social issues throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The negative consequences of prohibition then became increasingly clearer. As a result was an advocacy for harm reduction, which started to gain momentum throughout the 2000s. Several countries then began to reevaluate their drug policies. The legalization of medical marijuana is a good example of this and has now started to pave the way for recreational use drugs. This is first seen in states like Colorado, Washington, and New Mexico.
Let's start with the obvious. Not all drugs are the same, so not all drugs should be treated the same. We as a society need to correctly label and understand these drugs and why we treat them accordingly. We have some drugs that have already been legalized, like tobacco and marijuana, which has shown our society great benefits, but we also have illegal drugs like methamphetamine and fentanyl for obvious reasons. This from DRE directly themselves. They state we classify drugs in one of seven categories: central nervous system or CNS depressants, CNS stimulants, hallucinogenics, dissociative anesthetics, narcotic analgesics, inhalants, and cannabis. Drugs from each of these seven categories can affect a person's central nervous system and impair a person's normal facilities. So, in other words, yes, LSD and marijuana can both impair you, but for obviously two different reasons, they impair you for two very drastically different ways. Finally, I'm going to talk about why legalizing drugs is so beneficial to us as a society. We can break it down into three key points: the government profiting, medical aid, and public health. The legalization of drugs can generate a significant tax revenue from the sales of these newly regulated substances. Just as a reference of numbers, according to Making an Economic Case for Legalizing Drugs by Jeffrey Murin and Catherine Woodcock, they state legalization would also generate a tax revenue of roughly $46.7 billion annually if drugs were not taxed at rates comparable to those of alcohol and tobacco. So, in other words, we're literally making millions off of drugs like a cartel. But more seriously, it also reduces the costs associated with law enforcement, judicial proceedings, and incarceration related to drug crimes and offenses. Next, I want to talk about how these recreational drugs can be used for medical purposes. Recreational marijuana is a great example of how legalizing drugs could actually benefit us. We can use this drug for its innate properties as treatment for issues such as pain relief, appetite stimulation, anxiety, and anti inflammatory problems.
Just to round out, legalization often comes with an increased funding to access addiction treatment and to harm reduction services, improving health outcomes for users, as well as legalization to transport, sale, and possession of drugs would transform illegal activities into legitimate business transactions, promoting stability and reducing crime rates associated with drugs transactions. Throughout the course of this project and throughout many of the sources I've read, problems and concerns with drug legalization all stem from three major categories. The categories being the concern for health, the concern for the regulations and challenges, and the concern for crime rate and violence. All three of these problems root from the same problem, which is protecting the youth. To start with our first problem, health concerns. Many are concerned about society's acceptance of drug usage, almost fostering the idea of normalized addiction. They're also concerned about how overall health costs could outweigh the return from investment from drug legalization. For our second problem, many are concerned about the regulation challenges. Regulations, of course, would have to be set in place for any drug if being legalized, but many fear the regulations set in place wouldn't be able to handle the willpower of humans. So, in other words, lots just fear an outbreak of an overusage of drugs without a way to stop. For our last problem, crime rate and violence. While some argue that legalization reduces crime, others believe it could exacerbate issues such as drug trafficking and organized crime, as legal operations may still have an opportunity to thrive in a legal. For health concerns and the normalization of addiction, legalization does not inherently normalize addiction. Instead, it allows for a more informed approach of drug use. Just as alcohol and tobacco and how they are regulated, education and harm reduction strategies can promote responsible use and reduce this stigma. When concerned about the return on investment, while health costs may increasingly initially, legalization could ultimately lead to savings by reducing the expenses associated with law enforcement, incarceration, and untreated addiction. Moreover, tax revenues from legalized drugs can be reinvested into healthcare and addiction services, creating a net positive impact. In concerns with the regulation challenges, effective regulation with a well structured framework similar to alcohol and tobacco make it possible to manage the uses of drugs. Countries like Canada, the Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain have already legalized certain drugs like cannabis and have developed successful regulatory models that prohibit overusage of drugs, some examples being age restrictions and user safety standards. In terms of our last concern, crime rate and violence, legalization can significantly diminish the profits and power of drug cartels and organized crime groups. With a regulated market, there's less incentive for these illegal operations to thrive as illegal options provide a safer and more reliable access to these drugs. Legalization also allows these disputes to be resolved through the judicial system instead of violent means. This can lead to a decrease in gang related violent crimes and individuals seeking legal resources rather than resorting to crime or violence in a competitive illegal market. Drug legalization benefits us in multiple ways. When the government profits, we profit. We can use the profits from drug legalization to fund addiction treatment, our police enforcement, education, community programs, and much more. We can use some of these newly legalized drugs as a means of medicine and pain relief as well. Lastly, we could see a major decrease in crime and incarceration due to making drug transactions legitimate business transactions. Others have a fear of a major outbreak in crime and drug overusage, but it would take a mass effort for those problems to seriously impose the benefits of what legalization can bring us.